Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand up when everyone else is sitting down. Sometimes kindness shows up in the most unexpected places. When young Clara arrived in Willow Bend, clutching wildflowers and a small suitcase, the townsfolk saw only what she couldn't do. She was deaf, and to them that made her less. They mocked her. They turned away. But mountain man Luke Carver saw something different. He stepped forward and said words that would change everything. "I'd rather stand with her than you all." In teaching Clara to survive, Luke learned to listen with his heart. But when danger came riding in, the town would discover who the real heroes were. What made a lonely mountain man risk everything for a woman the whole town had rejected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Willow Bend sat nestled in a valley where the Montana Territory stretched wide and wild. A town carved out of hope and hardship in equal measure. The year was 1882, and the frontier still held its grip on the land and the people who tried to tame it. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot through the heart of town, flanked by wooden buildings that had weathered 20 harsh winters. The general store stood on one corner, the saloon on another, and between them lay the pulse of a community that prided itself on self-reliance and suspicion of anything that didn't fit their narrow definition of normal. Sheriff Wade. Dalton kept the peace with a firm hand and a fair mind, though he'd learned over the years that fairness didn't always mean popularity. He was a man in his 50s, grey threading through his dark hair, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days squinting into the sun, and longer nights wondering if he'd made the right choices. The town trusted him because he'd never asked them to be anything other than what they were, and he'd stood between them and trouble more times than most cared to remember. Mrs. Eleanor Henley ran the boarding house with the precision of a general and the warmth of a winter stone. She'd been widowed 15 years prior when her husband took sick with pneumonia, and she'd transformed her grief into an ironclad sense of propriety that she wielded like a weapon. In her mind, there was a right way to do things and a wrong way, and she'd appointed herself the arbiter of which was which. Her boarding house was clean, her rates were fair, and her judgment was swift. She believed in Christian charity the way she believed in starched linens, as long as everything stayed in its proper place. Porter Mackenzie owned the saloon and the attached general store, an unusual combination that had come about through necessity rather than choice. When the previous store owner drank himself to death, Porter had bought the business to keep his whiskey supplier close. He was a practical man, thick around the middle and thin on top, with hands that could pour a perfect drink or calculate an honest bill with equal ease. Unlike Mrs. Henley, Porter had seen enough of the world to know that different didn't always mean dangerous. He'd had a younger brother who died in the war, and he'd learned that good people came in all sorts of packages. Luke Carver was not a man of the town, though the town knew him well enough. He came down from his cabin in the high country once a month for supplies, spoke only as many words as necessary to conduct his business, and disappeared back into the mountains before anyone could press him for conversation. He was tall and lean, weathered by sun and wind, until his face seemed carved from the same granite as the peaks he called home. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they carried the weight of things he'd seen and done in his 38 years. Those who remembered his arrival a decade ago knew he'd been an army scout, one of the best, tracking hostile bands across territory where most men would lose their way and their scalp in equal measure. He'd come to Montana with a discharge, a little money, and a deep need for silence. The mountains had given him what he sought: distance from the violence he'd participated in, solitude from the questions he couldn't answer, and peace from the memories that haunted his sleep. His cabin sat high enough that winter snows made it unreachable for 4 months of the year, which suited Luke just fine. He'd built it with his own hands, each log chosen and placed with care, each chink sealed against the bitter wind. Inside, the space was spare but not uncomfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a narrow bed occupied another, and a rough-hewn table sat beneath the single window that looked out over the valley. On that table lay a worn leather journal, its pages filled with sketches of the wildlife he observed and sparse entries that revealed more in what they didn't say than what they did. The townsfolk respected Luke's skill and feared his temper. He'd broken a man's jaw once for mistreating a horse, and he'd stared down 3 armed drifters who'd thought to rob Porter's store. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, but trouble had learned not to look for him. Most folks gave him a wide berth and a respectful nod. And that was exactly how Luke preferred it. It was late April when the stagecoach rolled into Willow Bend, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. The driver, a leathery man named Silas, who'd been running this route for 15 years, pulled the team to a halt outside the boarding house with more care than usual. He climbed down stiffly, worked the kinks out of his back, and opened the coach door with something approaching gentleness. The young woman who stepped down couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. She wore a simple traveling dress the color of dried lavender, dusty from the journey, but well made. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face held a delicate strength like fine china that had somehow survived being dropped. In one hand, she carried a small suitcase bound with leather straps. In the other, she clutched a handful of wildflowers. Slightly wilted from the journey, but still bright with color, yellow arnica, purple lupine, and white columbine. Clara Brennan had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to reach this place, and every mile had been a step away from grief and towards something she couldn't quite name, but desperately needed. Hope, perhaps, or simply the chance to be seen as something other than broken. Silas helped her with her trunk, setting it on the boardwalk with a thump that drew attention from passers-by. "This is Willow Bend, miss," he said, speaking slowly and clearly the way he'd learned to do during their 3-day journey. "Mrs. Henley's boarding house is right here. She'll set you up proper." Clara smiled her thanks and nodded. She'd grown accustomed to people's discomfort when they realized she couldn't hear them, the way their faces changed from friendliness to awkward pity or uncomfortable withdrawal. She pulled a small card from her pocket, one she'd had printed before leaving Pennsylvania, and handed it to Silas. It read, "I am deaf. I can read lips if you speak clearly and face me. I can read and write. Thank you for your kindness." Silas read it, nodded with understanding, and tipped his hat. "You take care now, miss. This is decent country if you give it a chance." He wasn't sure she'd understood, but her smile suggested she had. Clara picked up her suitcase and approached the boarding house door. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Henley moving about inside, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Clara knocked, waited, and knocked again. When Mrs. Henley opened the door, her expression was pleasant enough until she took in the young woman before her. The dusty dress, the hopeful eyes, and most damning of all, the way Clara was watching her mouth rather than meeting her eyes in the customary way. "Yes?" Mrs. Henley said, and Clara, reading her lips, offered her card. Mrs. Henley took it, read it, and her expression shifted from pleasant to closed in the space of a heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she said, not bothering to face Clara directly, now that she knew the girl couldn't hear her tone. "I have no rooms available," Clara's smile faltered. She gestured to the rooms available sign in the window, then pointed to it and looked at Mrs. Henley with a question in her eyes. "No rooms for you," Mrs. Henley said more firmly, stepping back and beginning to close the door. "Try the next town over. Maybe they'll have something." The door shut with a finality that needed no translation. Clara stood there for a moment, the wildflowers trembling slightly in her hand before she turned away. She could feel the stairs now. The weight of eyes from across the street, from the store windows, from the men loitering near the saloon. She'd felt those stares before, in every town she'd passed through on her way west. Curiosity mixed with discomfort, pity tangled with rejection. A woman passing by with her daughter pulled the child closer and hurried past, as if deafness might be catching. 2 men outside the saloon exchanged glances, and one of them laughed, not kindly. Clara kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to show them how much it hurt, how tired she was of being treated like a burden or a curse. Across the street, Luke Carver had just finished loading supplies into his saddlebags when the stagecoach arrived. He'd glanced up out of habit, noting the new arrival the way he noted everything, cataloguing details without particular interest. He'd planned to mount up and head back to his cabin before the day grew too warm, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the flowers. Strange thing for a traveler to carry, those wildflowers. They spoke of someone who saw beauty even in hard places, who'd taken the time to gather them, despite whatever troubles had brought her to this remote corner of the territory. Or maybe it was the dignity in her bearing as Mrs. Henley turned her away, the way she refused to let her shoulders slump, even as rejection hit her square in the face. Luke watched as Clara stood alone on the boardwalk, suitcase in hand, with nowhere to go and no one to help her. He watched as the town he barely tolerated showed its ugly side, treating this young woman like an inconvenience to be ignored or mocked. He felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought long dead, anger on behalf of someone other than himself. He could have mounted his horse, could have ridden away and left her to figure out her own path. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that kept his life simple and solitary, the way he'd carefully arranged it. Instead, Luke Carver tied his horse's reins to the hitching post and walked across the dusty street toward a young woman who couldn't hear him coming. Clara sensed movement before she saw him. A shift in the air, or perhaps just the instinct that comes from years of paying attention to what others take for granted. She turned to find a tall man approaching, his face weathered and serious, his eyes studying her with an intensity that wasn't cruel, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. Luke stopped a respectful distance away and waited until she was looking at him before he spoke. "You need a place to stay." It wasn't a question, and he made sure to face her directly, speaking slowly enough that she could follow his words. Clara nodded, then pulled out her card and offered it to him. Luke took it, read it carefully, and handed it back. He glanced at the boarding house, then at the gathering crowd of onlookers, and made a decision that would change both their lives. "I have a cabin in the mountains. You can stay there until you find something in town." He pointed toward the peaks rising in the distance, then gestured to his horse. "If you're willing." Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for the deception or cruel humor she'd learned to watch for. She found neither. Just a straightforward offer from a man who looked like he didn't make them often. She glanced down at the wildflowers in her hand, then back at him, and nodded. Luke picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and secured it behind his saddle. Clara kept her suitcase and climbed up behind him when he mounted, settling herself with the careful balance of someone who'd ridden before. As they started up the mountain trail, she looked back once at Willow Bend and the people who'd turned her away. She didn't know if she'd ever return, and at that moment she wasn't sure she cared. The ride took most of the afternoon. Luke didn't try to speak to her as they traveled, which Clara appreciated. She watched the landscape change around them, the scrub grass and sparse trees of the valley giving way to dense pine forests and rocky outcrops. The air grew cooler and cleaner, scented with resin and wildflowers that grew in unexpected patches among the stones. Eagles circled overhead, and once she spotted a deer watching them from a meadow, its ears pricked forward in curiosity rather than fear. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing that faced west toward the setting sun. It was small but solid, built with care by someone who understood how harsh these mountains could be. Smoke-darkened stones formed a chimney, and a narrow porch ran along the front, offering shelter from rain and a place to sit on summer evenings. Luke dismounted and helped Clara down, then carried her trunk inside. She followed, stepping over the threshold into a space that was surprisingly clean and orderly. The single room held everything necessary and nothing extra. The stone fireplace she'd seen from outside, a narrow bed covered with rough blankets, a table and 2 chairs beneath the window, and shelves holding supplies and a few books. What caught her attention most was the leather journal lying on the table, its pages covered with detailed sketches of animals and mountains. Luke set her trunk in the corner and turned to face her. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." He gestured to make his meaning clear, pointing to the bed, and then to her, then to the floor and himself. Clara shook her head firmly and pointed to the floor, then to herself. She wouldn't take his bed. Luke started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. They'd work it out later. He moved to the fireplace and built up a fire against the evening chill, his movements practiced and efficient. Clara set her suitcase on the table and opened it, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Luke saw an embroidered sampler, the kind young women made to practice their stitching. This one showed a farmhouse surrounded by trees, with 4 figures standing in front, a man, a woman, and 2 children. One clearly a girl with dark hair like Clara's. Clara held it carefully, running her fingers over the stitches, and Luke understood without being told that these were people she'd lost. Family, the home she'd left behind, one way or another. She set the sampler on the shelf with reverence, then turned to find Luke watching her. He moved to the table and picked up a pencil and paper, writing in clear block letters. What happened to them? Clara took the pencil, her hand steady despite the memories. Fire 2 years ago. I was in the barn. Couldn't hear them calling. Couldn't help. Only one who survived. Luke read the words twice, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. He'd seen enough death in his years as a scout to know that survival carried its own burden, especially when you survived alone. He wrote, "I'm sorry." Clara nodded her thanks, then wrote, "I came west for work. I can sew, embroider, mend. Thought maybe I could find a place where people needed skills more than they fear differences. They fear what they don't understand," Luke wrote. "Doesn't make them right." They communicated this way through the evening, writing back and forth as Luke prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread left over from his last baking. Clara watched how he moved around the small space, economical and purposeful, and she began to understand that this man had chosen solitude not from misanthropy, but from need. He was someone who'd seen too much noise and chaos and had come seeking peace. As they ate, Clara wrote, "Why did you help me?" Luke stared at the question for a long time before answering, "Because nobody else would. And because I remember what it's like to be treated as less than human." Clara wanted to know more, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes went distant, and she understood that some stories needed time before they could be told. She wrote instead, "Thank you. I won't be a burden." Luke's response was immediate. "You're not a burden. You're a person who needs help. There's a difference." As darkness fell and the fire burned low, Luke gave Clara the bed despite her protests, and he rolled out a bedroll on the floor by the hearth. Clara lay awake for a long time, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, listening to the silence that was never really silent. She could feel the vibrations of the wind against the walls, the crackle of the fire that she sensed more than heard, and the steady breathing of the man who'd chosen to stand with her when no one else would. She thought about the sampler on the shelf, about her parents and her younger brother, about the life that had burned away in a single terrible night. She thought about the months of wandering that had followed, the towns that had turned her away, the jobs she'd been refused, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. And she thought about the mountain man who'd crossed a street to help a stranger, who'd brought her to his sanctuary without asking for anything in return. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the window, and Clara woke to find Luke already up, stirring something in a pot over the fire. He turned when he sensed her movement and nodded a greeting. After they'd eaten a simple breakfast of porridge and coffee, Luke brought her outside to show her the lay of the land. He pointed out the creek that provided water, the path that led down to the valley, the places where game trails crossed. Clara watched his gestures and began to understand that he wasn't just showing her around, he was teaching her how to survive here, how to be independent, how to stand on her own if she needed to. When they returned to the cabin, Luke pulled out paper and pencil again. "If you're going to stay here, even for a while, you need to learn the mountains. How to find food, water, shelter, how to protect yourself. I can teach you if you're willing to learn." Clara's response came quickly. I'm willing. Luke wrote one more line. It won't be easy. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. Clara picked up the pencil and met his eyes as she wrote, "Nothing worth doing ever is." That afternoon, Luke began Clara's education in earnest. He showed her how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to read animal tracks in the soft earth near the creek, how to tell direction by the sun and stars. Clara proved to be an attentive student, absorbing information with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. As the sun began to set, Luke realized something that both surprised and unsettled him. He'd talked more today, even through writing, than he had in months. He'd shared knowledge, shown patience, felt something almost like satisfaction in watching Clara learn. The solitude he'd carefully cultivated was already beginning to crack, and he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. That evening, a rider appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. Luke recognized Sheriff Dalton's horse before he could make out the man himself. Clara noticed Luke tense and followed his gaze, seeing the approaching rider. Dalton pulled up outside the cabin and dismounted, his weathered face neutral, but his eyes curious. Luke stepped out to meet him, and Clara stood in the doorway watching. "Luke," Dalton said with a nod, "heard you took in that deaf girl from the stagecoach. Mrs. Henley's got the whole town talking." "Clara," Luke said flatly. "Her name is Clara, and it's my cabin. My business who stays here." "Didn't say it wasn't," Dalton replied, his tone reasonable. "Just came to make sure everything's all right. Girl's alone, you're alone. People wonder about propriety." "People can wonder all they want," Luke said, his voice edged with steel. "She had nowhere else to go. Would you have taken her in, Sheriff?" "Would any of them?" Dalton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That's not the point. That's exactly the point. Town turned her away because she's different. Because she scared them somehow. Well, she doesn't scare me, and she's staying until she finds proper work and lodging. You got a problem with that? You can take it up with me directly." The sheriff studied Luke for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No problem with it. Just doing my job, checking on things. You need anything, you let me know." "We're fine," Luke said, but his tone had softened slightly. Dalton was a decent man, doing his best in a difficult situation. As the sheriff rode away, Luke turned back to find Clara standing in the doorway, her eyes questioning. He walked over to her and wrote on the paper he'd started carrying in his pocket, "Sheriff checking on you. Told him you're staying. Town will talk, but they can talk all they want." Clara read the words, then wrote her response. "I don't want to cause you trouble." Luke's answer was firm. "You're not the one causing trouble. They are, and I stopped caring what people thought a long time ago." But as he watched Clara go back inside, Luke knew that wasn't entirely true. He didn't care what most people thought, but he'd begun to care what she thought. And that realization, more than anything that had happened that day, told him that his carefully ordered life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict or control. The days took on a rhythm that surprised Luke with its naturalness. Each morning he and Clara would rise with the sun, share a simple breakfast, and then begin the day's lessons. Luke had expected awkwardness, the stumbling discomfort of two strangers forced into proximity, but instead found an easy companionship building between them. Clara proved to be more than an attentive student. She was intuitive, picking up on patterns and connections that Luke sometimes forgot to explain outright. When he showed her how to identify deer tracks, she immediately noticed the difference between a buck's heavier tread and a doe's lighter step. When he demonstrated how to test the wind direction with a wetted finger, she understood without being told why it mattered for tracking game. Their communication evolved rapidly beyond the initial exchange of written notes. They developed a language of their own, part gesture, part expression, part instinct. Luke learned to read Clara's face, the way he read animal signs in the forest. A slight furrow of her brow meant confusion. A tilt of her head indicated a question. A small smile suggested she'd understood something new. In turn, Clara became adept at anticipating his movements, understanding his intentions before he fully expressed them. One morning, a week after Clara's arrival, Luke brought out his father's hunting knife. It was a beautiful piece, the blade still sharp after years of use, the handle worn smooth by his father's hand and then his own. The steel had been folded and reforged by a craftsman who understood that a knife could mean the difference between survival and starvation in wild country. He handed it to Clara, watching as she examined it with the careful appreciation of someone who recognized quality work. Luke gestured for her to follow him outside, where he'd set up a piece of wood on a stump. For the next hour, he taught her the basics of knife work, how to grip it properly, how to use the weight of the blade rather than just muscle, how to maintain the edge with a whetstone. Clara's hands were small but steady, and she approached the lesson with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Luke found himself impressed by her lack of squeamishness. When he demonstrated how to field dress a rabbit he'd snared the previous evening, she watched closely and didn't flinch at the blood or the reality of turning a living creature into food. By midday, they walked to the creek, where Luke had shown her the best fishing spot. He'd fashioned a simple rod for her, from a willow branch, line and hook, and he demonstrated the art of reading the water, finding the places where trout liked to hold in the current. Clara cast her line with increasing confidence, and when she felt the first sharp tug, her eyes went wide with excitement. Luke waded in to help her land it, his hand covering hers on the rod to show her how to play the fish without breaking the line. The trout was a good size, its scales flashing rainbow colors in the sunlight, and when Clara finally brought it to shore, her smile was bright enough to rival the sun itself. Luke found himself smiling back, a rare expression that felt strange on his face, but not unwelcome. That evening, as they cooked the trout over the fire, Clara noticed how the cabin had begun to change. She'd been making small improvements, things she did almost without thinking, mending the torn curtain that covered the storage alcove, sweeping the floor each morning, organizing the shelves so that supplies were easier to find. She'd even gathered wildflowers and put them in a tin cup on the table, adding a touch of color to the austere space. Luke had noticed these changes too, though he hadn't said anything. The cabin felt different now, more lived in, almost like a home rather than just a shelter. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, about the domesticity creeping into his solitude. But he couldn't deny that coming back from checking his trap lines to find Clara there, the cabin warm and the table set for dinner, stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. While things settled into a comfortable pattern at the cabin, trouble was brewing in Willow Bend. The town council met in Porter's saloon after hours, the main topic of conversation being Luke Carver and his houseguest. Mrs. Henley led the charge, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "It's improper is what it is. A man and a woman, unmarried, living together up in those mountains. What kind of example does that set?" "Example for who?" Porter asked mildly, pouring whiskey into glasses lined up on the bar. "Nearest neighbor's 5 miles away. Don't see how what Luke does on his own property affects anyone here. It affects the moral character of this community," Mrs. Henley insisted. "That girl needs proper supervision. She should be in a Christian household, learning proper ways. She came to your door first," Porter reminded her. "You turned her away." Mrs. Henley's face colored. "I had my reasons. A boarding house isn't equipped to handle someone with her affliction. Her affliction," Sheriff Dalton said quietly, "is that she can't hear. Doesn't make her dangerous or immoral. Just makes her deaf." "That's not the point," Mrs. Henley snapped. "The point is she needs proper care, proper guidance. Not to be living in sin with a mountain man who barely qualifies as civilized." "Careful," Dalton warned, his tone hardening. "Luke Carver's done more for this territory than most. Tracked down that band of horse thieves 2 years back when nobody else could find them. Guided the survey team through Devil's Pass when they would have been lost for weeks otherwise. Man keeps to himself and doesn't cause trouble. I'd call that pretty civilized." The debate continued for another hour, with the council eventually deciding to take no official action but to monitor the situation. Mrs. Henley left dissatisfied, convinced that someone needed to do something about Luke and Clara, though what that something might be remained unclear. Porter stayed behind after the others left, helping Dalton stack chairs and blow out lamps. "This is going to cause problems," he said quietly. "Already has," Dalton replied. "Question is how big the problems get before people start minding their own business. You know Eleanor won't let this go. She's like a dog with a bone once she gets an idea in her head." "I know it. But Luke's within his rights, and so's the girl. Can't force them to do anything just because it makes some folks uncomfortable." Porter nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter Sarah mentioned wanting to meet Clara. Said it wasn't right, how she was treated when she arrived. Girl's got a good heart. Sarah's young enough not to have calcified in her thinking," Dalton said. "Give her my regards, and tell her if she wants to ride up to Luke's place, I'll escort her if it makes you feel better about it." Back at the cabin, Clara sat by the fire with paper and pencil, writing out her thoughts the way she'd done since childhood. It helped her process the day, to see her experiences translated into words. She wrote about the fishing, about the knife Luke had let her use, about the small ways the cabin was starting to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like something she was afraid to name. She paused, pencil hovering over the paper, as she tried to capture the feeling that had been growing in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude, though she was grateful. It wasn't just relief at having a safe place, though she felt that too. It was something warmer and more complicated. Something that stirred when Luke smiled at her success with the trout. Something that tightened in her chest when he sat close to show her how to sharpen the knife properly. Luke noticed her distraction and gestured at the paper, a question on his face. Clara hesitated, then turned the paper so he could read what she'd written. "I've never felt safer than I do here." "Thank you for giving me that." Luke read the words, then picked up his own pencil and wrote beneath hers, "You make the cabin feel less empty." "Thank you for that." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them that neither was quite ready to name or acknowledge. But it was there, undeniable as the fire's warmth, as the coming of night, as the slow turn of the seasons. Change was happening to both of them, whether they were ready for it or not. Clara folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket, a small treasure to keep. Luke watched her do it, and found himself hoping she'd keep writing, keep sharing her thoughts with him. Because somewhere in the past week, he'd stopped thinking of her as a responsibility or a temporary guest. He'd started thinking of her as Clara, just Clara. And that simple shift meant everything. The first day without Luke felt strange. Clara went about her tasks with practiced efficiency, tending the chickens they'd acquired, checking the garden, maintaining the cabin, but the space felt emptier without his quiet presence. She'd grown accustomed to his companionship in ways she hadn't fully realized until it was absent. By the second day, Clara had settled into confidence. She successfully hunted a rabbit, using the snares Luke had taught her to set, Field dressed it with the knife he'd given her, and prepared it for dinner with herbs from their garden. That evening, sitting alone by the fire, she felt a quiet pride in her self-sufficiency. Luke had taught her well, and she'd proven herself worthy of his instruction. On the third morning, Clara decided to visit town for her regular work at Margaret's shop. She saddled Luke's mare, he'd left her the gentler horse, and made the ride down the mountain with growing confidence. The trail that had seemed treacherous weeks ago now felt familiar, every turn and landmark committed to memory. The day at the shop passed pleasantly. Sarah was full of news and gossip, her hands flying through signs as she told Clara about the upcoming church social and who was courting whom. Clara worked on Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter's wedding dress, her needle creating delicate patterns in the lace that transformed the garment from ordinary to extraordinary. It was late afternoon when Clara finished her work and prepared to return to the cabin. Sarah walked with her to where the horse was tied, chattering about teaching more people in town to sign. "Even old Mr. Henderson is learning," she signed and spoke simultaneously. "He said he never realized how much he could say without words." Clara hugged her friend goodbye and mounted the horse. As she guided the mare toward the edge of town, 3 men stepped out from the alley beside the livery stable. Clara recognized them immediately, the ranch hands from weeks before. including the scarred man who'd made crude suggestions about her relationship with Luke. Without Luke's protective presence, they grew bold. The scarred man grabbed the mare's bridle, stopping Clara from riding past. His companions moved to flank her, cutting off any escape route. Their mouths were moving, words Clara couldn't hear, but their intentions were clear in their leering expressions and aggressive postures. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Luke had taught her not to show fear, that predators, human or animal, fed on it. She sat straight in the saddle, her hand moving subtly toward the saddlebag where she'd stored the pistol Luke insisted she carry. The scarred man reached up, as if to pull her from the horse, and that's when Sarah's scream cut through the afternoon air. The young woman had been watching from the shop doorway, and she ran toward them now, shouting for help. Porter appeared moments later, moving with surprising speed for a man of his size, and Sheriff Dalton emerged from his office across the street. "Let her go," Dalton ordered, his hand resting on his gun. "Now!" The scarred man released the bridle but held his ground. "Just having a conversation, Sheriff." "No law against that?" "There's a law against threatening women," Dalton replied coldly. "And I'd say surrounding someone and preventing them from leaving counts as a threat. You boys have somewhere else to be." The three men exchanged glances, then stepped back. But the scarred one looked up at Clara with undisguised malice. "Your mountain man won't always be around to protect you. Remember that." Clara met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated, then urged the mare forward. Porter and Sarah walked beside her to the edge of town, both concerned. "You should stay in town tonight," Porter suggested, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Sarah signed his words, and Clara shook her head firmly. She signed back, "I won't be afraid. I won't let them win." Sarah hugged her fiercely. "Be careful, please." Clara nodded and rode out of town, but her composure crumbled once she was out of sight. Her hands shook on the reins, and she had to stop for a moment to breathe deeply, to calm the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. But she didn't turn back. Luke had taught her courage, and she wouldn't dishonor those lessons by running. The ride back took longer than usual because Clara stopped frequently to check her surroundings, making sure she wasn't being followed. By the time she reached the cabin, dusk was falling and her nerves were frayed. She secured the horse, locked the cabin door, and loaded the rifle before allowing herself to relax. That evening, she worked on a small project she'd been saving, a pair of beaded bracelets made from beads she'd traded for from a traveling merchant who'd passed through town. She'd designed them simply but carefully, with patterns that meant something. Mountains for strength, stars for guidance, wildflowers for hope. One for herself, one for Luke. As her hands worked the familiar patterns, Clara's mind wandered to Luke. Where was he tonight? Was he safe? Had he found the outlaws Sheriff Dalton mentioned? The not knowing gnawed at her, made worse by her inability to hear if someone approached, to catch warnings others might take for granted. She thought about the confrontation in town, about the scarred man's threat. Part of her wanted Luke back immediately, wanted his protection and his presence. But another part, the part Luke had helped her find and strengthen, refused to be the helpless victim these men wanted her to be. She'd survived the loss of her family, survived crossing half a country alone, survived rejection and cruelty. She could survive this too. Clara placed the finished bracelet on her wrist, adjusting the fit. She set Luke's bracelet carefully on the table, where he'd see it when he returned. Because he would return. She had to believe that. She checked the rifle one more time, made sure the door was barred, and settled by the fire with Luke's journal. He'd told her she could read it if she wished, and tonight she needed the comfort of his words. The entries were sparse, mostly observations about weather and wildlife. But occasionally there were glimpses of the man beneath the solitary exterior. One entry from a month before her arrival caught her eye. Another winter coming. The silence used to feel like peace. Now it just feels empty. Maybe a man can have too much solitude. Maybe being alone and being at peace aren't the same thing after all. Clara traced the words with her finger, understanding for the first time how lonely Luke had been before she arrived, how much their companionship meant to him. She'd thought she was the one being rescued, but perhaps they'd rescued each other. That night she slept fitfully, waking at every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind. Her instincts were on high alert, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving her. When she finally dozed off near dawn, she dreamed of fire and running, and voices she couldn't hear, but knew were screaming. She woke to full daylight, and the certain knowledge that something was wrong. The quality of the light seemed off, the shadows falling at angles that didn't feel right. Clara grabbed the rifle and moved to the window carefully, scanning the tree line. At first she saw nothing. Then movement, a figure slipping between trees, trying to stay hidden. Clara's heart rate spiked. Someone was out there, watching the cabin. One of the ranch hands? Or something worse? She remembered Luke's teachings about emergency signals. Moving quickly, she gathered materials for a smoke signal while keeping watch on the tree line. If Luke was close enough to see it, he'd know she needed help. If not, at least she was doing something rather than waiting passively for trouble to find her. As she worked to build the signal fire on the cleared space behind the cabin, Clara caught another glimpse of the figure. He was moving closer now, more bold. She could see enough to know it wasn't one of the ranch hands from town. This man was dressed differently, more ragged, with the look of someone who lived rough, an outlaw. One of the men Luke was tracking, and he'd found the cabin, Clara's. Hands moved with practiced efficiency as she set up the emergency. Signal Luke had taught her, mirror, flashes in a specific pattern, followed by smoke signals using green pine branches that would create white smoke against the blue sky. Her heart pounded, but her movements were steady. Fear was natural, panic was deadly. Luke had taught her that. The figure in the trees had stopped advancing, perhaps confused by her purposeful activity. Clara completed the signal, then retreated to the cabin, barring the door and positioning herself by the window with the rifle. She'd learned to shoot well enough to hit what she aimed at, and Luke had been clear, if someone threatened her life, she shouldn't hesitate to defend it. Hours passed in tense silence. The figure disappeared from view, but Clara's instincts told her he hadn't left. She maintained her vigilance, occasionally adding green branches to keep the signal fire smoking. Afternoon shadows were lengthening when she finally saw movement that made her breath catch. Luke's familiar form riding hard up the trail. His horse lathered from the pace. He'd seen her signal and come immediately. Luke dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his eyes scanning the area with trained precision. Clara opened the door and he swept inside, checking her for injury before pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. Then he was all business again, moving to the window to assess the situation. Clara handed him paper and quickly wrote what had happened. The man in the trees, how he'd been watching the cabin, how she'd signaled. Luke's jaw tightened as he read. Then he wrote back, "Did you see enough to describe him?" Clara nodded and sketched quickly. A rough man, bearded, wearing dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. Something about the way she drew the eyes made Luke pause. He pulled something from his saddlebag, a wanted poster he'd gotten from Sheriff Dalton. The moment Clara saw it, her face went white. Her hands began to shake, and she dropped the paper, backing away from it as if it were a snake. Luke caught her arms gently, steadying her, confused by the intensity of her reaction. He picked up the poster and looked at it again. Cyrus Blackwood and his gang, wanted for robbery, murder, and arson across 3 territories. Then he saw it. One line in the description, known for using fire to eliminate witnesses. Last confirmed sighting near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania 2 years prior. Luke's world tilted. Pennsylvania. 2 years ago. Fire. He looked at Clara, who'd sunk into a chair, her whole body trembling. He knelt in front of her, making her look at him, and wrote slowly, "Is this the man? From the fire that killed your family?" Clara's nod was barely perceptible, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed the pencil with shaking hands and wrote in desperate, uneven letters, "He was there. I saw him. I was in the barn, saw torches through the window. Saw him give the order. My family, they were asleep. I felt the vibrations, felt the heat. Couldn't save them. Hid in the hayloft until morning." Luke felt rage build in his chest, white-hot and demanding. This man had murdered Clara's family, had traumatized her so deeply she'd fled across a continent to escape the memories. And now he was here, circling like a predator, possibly recognizing the deaf girl who'd witnessed his crime. He wrote, "We need to get you to town. Tell the sheriff everything. This changes what we're dealing with." But even as he wrote it, Luke realized the terrible truth. If Blackwood was here near Willow Bend, it wasn't coincidence. The gang had been hitting homesteads, moving south. They'd been scouting, and one of them had found this cabin. If Blackwood saw Clara, recognized her as the witness who'd survived, she'd become a target. And worse, Willow Bend would become a target too. They rode to town as dusk fell, Luke keeping Clara close, his senses alert for any threat. At the sheriff's office, Porter was already there, having come to report that some of his whiskey stock had been stolen, a sure sign someone was operating nearby who didn't want to show themselves in town. Luke pushed the door open, and everyone turned. "We need to talk, now!" For the next hour, Clara wrote out her story, while the men read in grim silence. The fire that killed her family hadn't been an accident. It had been murder, orchestrated by Blackwood's gang because her father had witnessed one of their robberies. He'd been a farmer traveling to market, had seen them hold up a stage, could identify them. So they'd eliminated the witness and his family to tie up loose ends. Only Clara had survived, though the gang didn't know it. She'd been found the next morning in shock, unable to speak of what she'd seen for weeks. By the time she could, the gang had vanished, and the investigation went cold. No one connected a random farmhouse fire in Pennsylvania to a gang operating primarily in the Western Territories. "They're here now," Luke said grimly. "One of them found my cabin, saw Clara. If Blackwood realizes she's the same girl, she's a witness who can identify him." Sheriff Dalton finished. "That makes her a threat he'll want to eliminate," Porter spoke up. "But it makes Willow Bend a problem too. If he hits here, Clara might see him. Easier to just take out the whole town than risk her talking." The weight of that realization settled over them. Clara's presence, her survival, had brought danger to everyone in Willow Bend. She grabbed the pencil and wrote frantically, "I'll leave. I'll go somewhere far away. I won't put you all at risk." "No," Luke said firmly, speaking aloud even though she couldn't hear him, then writing it so she could see. "You're not running. Not from this. Not from him. He took your family. He doesn't get to take your home too." "Luke's right," Porter said, and then to Clara's surprise, added in halting signs that Sarah had taught him, "You stay. We fight." Sheriff Dalton pulled out a map and spread it on his desk. "Blackwood's gang is 6 men, all of them dangerous. Luke, you found their camp?" Luke nodded and pointed to a location in the hills north of town. "They're scouting the area, planning something big. My guess is they're planning to hit Willow Bend, bank stores, everything worth taking." "When?" Dalton asked. "Soon, maybe 3 days. They're waiting for something, probably checking to make sure there's no federal marshals nearby." The sheriff looked at the men gathered in his office, then at Clara. "We've got 3 days to prepare. This town's never faced anything like this, but we've got something they don't expect, Luke's military experience and advance warning. Can we do this?" Luke thought about the town that had rejected Clara, about Mrs. Henley's cruelty and the ranch hand's threats. He thought about good people like Porter and Margaret and Sarah who'd shown kindness. He thought about Clara and the life they were beginning to build together. He thought about Blackwood and what he'd done to an innocent family. "Yes," he said, "but we do it my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We turn this town into a fortress, and we make them think twice about hitting us. It won't be pretty, but if everyone follows orders, we can survive this." Dalton extended his hand. "Then you're in charge of defense. Tell us what you need." As they began planning through the night, Clara sat quietly, watching Luke transform from solitary mountain man into military commander. This was who he'd been before, she realized. A leader of men, someone who made hard decisions and carried the weight of others' lives. He'd left that behind, but now it was back because she needed him. Because the town needed him. Mrs. Henley arrived near midnight, having heard about the emergency meeting. When she learned what was happening, she stood in shocked silence. Then she approached Clara, who looked up warily. Mrs. Henley pulled out paper and wrote, "I owe you an apology. I was cruel when you needed kindness. I judged you for being different when I should have seen your strength. If you'll forgive me, I want to help however I can." Clara read the words twice, seeing genuine remorse in the older woman's eyes. She wrote back, "I forgive you. Now let's save this town together." Mrs. Henley nodded, tears in her eyes, and squeezed Clara's hand. Luke watched the exchange and felt something shift in his chest. Clara had that effect. She made people better, made them see past their own prejudices, made them want to be worthy of her courage. She'd done it to him, and now she was doing it to a town that had rejected her. As dawn broke, Luke addressed the assembled townspeople who'd gathered after word spread. 3 days from now, dangerous men are coming to Willow Bend. They're coming to rob you, terrorize you, and probably burn half the town doing it. We can run, or we can stand and fight. I'm standing. Who's with me?" The response was immediate and unified. Even those who'd scorned Clara raised their hands. Whatever differences had divided the town, the threat of violence unified them. Luke began organizing immediately. Men were divided into defensive units. Women prepared medical supplies and food stores. Buildings were fortified. Ammunition was distributed. Luke drew on every tactical lesson he'd learned in years of military service, turning Willow Bend from a simple frontier town into a defendable position. And through it all, Clara worked alongside them, no longer the outsider they'd rejected, but one of them, fighting for their shared home. She helped prepare medical supplies, taught the other women basic triage techniques through Margaret's translation. She helped inventory ammunition and weapons. She did everything asked of her and more, proving her worth with every action. On the second evening of preparation, as townspeople worked late by lantern light, Luke found Clara on the porch of Porter's store. He sat beside her, and in the darkness he took her hand. He wrote by lamplight, "When this is over, if we survive, I want to ask you something important. But I need you to know first, you're the bravest person I've ever met. What you've survived, what you've overcome, who you've become. I was dying up in those mountains, dying from the inside out, and I didn't even know it until you arrived. You saved me, Clara. In every way a person can be saved." Clara read the words through tears, then wrote, "You saw me when everyone else looked away. You treated me like I mattered when the world said I didn't. Whatever you want to ask, the answer is yes." Dawn of the third day broke clear and cold. With a sky so blue, it seemed impossible that violence might shatter the peace before nightfall. Luke stood on the roof of Porter's saloon, the highest vantage point in town, surveying the defensive positions they'd spent 2.5 days preparing. Willow Bend had transformed from a sleepy frontier settlement into something resembling a military outpost. Sheriff Dalton joined him, moving carefully across the pitched roof. "Never thought I'd see this town come together like this," he said quietly. "Whatever happens today, you did that." "Clara did that," Luke corrected. "People are fighting for her, fighting to prove they're better than they were when she arrived." Below them, the town stirred to life. Men checked weapons and took up positions behind barricades constructed from wagons, barrels, and lumber. Women gathered in the church, the sturdiest building designated as shelter for those not fighting. Children had been sent to outlying farms the day before, much to their parents' relief. Luke had organized the defense with careful precision, drawing on tactics he'd learned in army service. The main street formed a natural kill zone, with elevated positions on rooftops and reinforced positions behind cover. He'd placed his best shots where they'd do the most good, and positioned less experienced men where they could provide supporting fire without being exposed to the worst danger. Porter's saloon served as command center, with supplies, ammunition, and medical equipment stored in the back room. Margaret and Clara worked there with 3 other women, preparing bandages and laying out the grim necessities of battlefield medicine: whiskey for pain, needles and thread for stitching wounds, hot water and clean cloth for cleaning injuries. Mrs. Henley surprised everyone by proving to be an excellent coordinator, organizing the women with military efficiency. She'd appointed herself Clara's particular guardian, staying close and translating anything that needed to be communicated quickly. The transformation in her had been remarkable. Guilt and genuine crisis had cracked through years of rigid propriety to reveal the capable, caring woman beneath. Sarah refused to stay in the church, insisting on remaining with Clara and her mother. She learned enough medical basics to be useful, and her steady hands and calm demeanor made her valuable in the medical station. Luke had one major concern: Clara herself. She insisted on helping, on being part of the defense, but he knew that if Blackwood saw her, if he recognized her, she'd become an immediate target. They'd argued about it through frantic written exchanges, but Clara had been adamant. This was her fight too. These were her people now. She wouldn't hide while others faced danger because of her. They'd compromised. Clara would stay in the medical station, out of direct sight, but armed and ready to defend herself if necessary. Luke had given her his father's hunting knife to supplement the pistol she carried, and he'd made her promise that if things went badly, she'd use the escape route he'd shown her, through the back of Porter's store and up into the hills. Mid-morning brought Luke's scouts racing back with news. The gang had broken camp and was moving toward town. 6 men, heavily armed, riding with the confidence of those who'd done this before and expected no real resistance. They'd underestimated Willow Bend. Luke gathered his key people for final instructions. Remember, we want them in the center of town before we spring the trap. Let them commit. Nobody fires until I give the signal. Understood? Nods all around. These weren't soldiers, but they were determined people protecting their homes. That would have to be enough. In the medical station, Clara checked her supplies one more time, then pulled out something she'd been carrying close. A tarnished medal Luke had shown her in a moment of vulnerability. It was from his army service, recognition for valor during a particularly brutal engagement. He'd put it away years ago, wanting no reminders of that life. But he'd shown it to her when explaining why he understood violence and feared it in equal measure. She'd asked to keep it during the battle, a talisman of sorts, a connection to him when he'd be up on that roof, exposed and directing the defense. He'd agreed reluctantly, touched by the request. Now she held it, running her thumb over the worn metal, praying to a god she couldn't hear but trusted anyway. The church bell rang once, the signal. Riders were visible on the north road. Clara felt the vibration through the floorboards and knew the battle was about to begin. Margaret squeezed her hand. Sarah moved closer. Mrs. Henley positioned herself near the door, ready to relay information from outside. On the rooftop, Luke watched through his army-issue field glasses as 6 men rode into view. He recognized Blackwood immediately from the wanted posters. A tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who'd commanded men before turning to crime. Former Confederate cavalry, if Luke's instincts were right. That made him dangerous and experienced. The gang rode slowly, assessing the town, noting the unusual quiet. Blackwood raised his hand, signaling his men to stop. He was suspicious, smart enough to sense something was wrong. The street should have people, activity, normal life. Instead, it was empty, still, waiting. Something's not right, Blackwood said to his lieutenant. A scarred man named Yates. Town's too quiet. Maybe they heard we were coming. Ran off, Yates suggested. Maybe, Blackwood said, but he didn't sound convinced. His hand rested on his pistol as his eyes scanned windows and roof lines. Looking for the trap he sensed but couldn't see, Luke held his breath. If Blackwood spooked now, if he turned and ran, they'd lose the advantage. The gang would regroup, change tactics, hit them when they weren't prepared. It had to be now. Blackwood made his decision. Spread out. Check the buildings. If anyone's here, we'll flush them out. He gestured to his men, and they began to dismount, moving toward the bank and store. Luke waited until they were committed, until they'd stepped into the kill zone with no easy retreat. Then he raised his rifle and fired a single shot that kicked up dust at Blackwood's feet, the signal to spring the ambush. All around the street, men rose from cover and opened fire. The carefully orchestrated plan executed perfectly. Blackwood's gang, caught in the open, dove for whatever cover they could find. 2 went down immediately, hit by the first volley. The other 4 returned fire, but they were pinned down, exposed exactly where Luke wanted them. "Hold positions," Luke shouted. "Make every shot count." The battle erupted in earnest. Yates, the lieutenant, proved as dangerous as Luke feared, managing to flank around behind the livery stable and threaten Porter's position. Luke saw the movement and relocated, running across rooftops in a dangerous sprint, drawing Yates's attention and fire. They exchanged shots, both men understanding they were facing a skilled opponent. Luke had the high ground, but Yates had cover. It became a chess game of position and patience, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Meanwhile, Blackwood rallied his remaining men, 3 counting himself. They'd found cover behind the water trough and were laying down concentrated fire, trying to suppress the defenders enough to make a break for their horses. Bodies of the 2 fallen gang members lay in the dust, grim reminders of the cost of this fight. In the medical station, Clara felt every vibration, every boom of gunfire transmitted through the building's structure. She couldn't hear the battle, but she could sense it, the impacts, the movements, the deadly rhythm of combat. Her hands moved automatically, preparing supplies she prayed wouldn't be needed, but knew would be. The first wounded arrived within minutes, a townsman named Henderson, shot through the shoulder. Margaret and Clara worked together, stopping the bleeding, cleaning and binding the wound, while Henderson gritted his teeth against pain. Sarah held his hand, offering comfort while her mother and Clara worked. More wounded followed. Nothing fatal yet, but the grim possibility hung in the air like the gun smoke drifting through town. Mrs. Henley moved between patients with surprising competence, her boarding house training in dealing with sick guests translating well to trauma care. On the rooftop, Luke and Yates finally reached their conclusion. Luke had worked his way around, using the roof lines to get an angle Yates couldn't counter. When the outlaw leaned out to fire at Porter again, Luke took the shot. Yates went down hard and didn't move, but the victory came at a cost. In focusing on Yates, Luke had exposed himself. A bullet from one of Blackwood's men caught him across the ribs, a burning line of pain that staggered him. He dropped behind the roof's false front, pressing his hand against the wound. Not deep, but bleeding freely. He'd need attention soon, but not yet. Not while Blackwood still lived. Below, Sheriff Dalton had worked his way behind Blackwood's position. The outlaw leader was down to 2 men now, both wounded, both running low on ammunition. The fight was ending, the outcome decided. Blackwood knew it, could feel his options narrowing. That's when he saw her. Clara had moved to the doorway of the medical station, checking on something outside, and for just a moment, she was visible from Blackwood's position. He'd been scanning for an escape route, any way out of this disaster, when his eyes locked on her face. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. The deaf girl. From Pennsylvania. The farmer's daughter who should have died in that fire 2 years ago. She'd survived. She'd witnessed. And she was here, in this God-forsaken town that had somehow managed to turn his planned robbery into an ambush. Blackwood's face twisted with rage and desperate calculation. If he was going down, he'd take her with him. The witness who could identify him, testify against him, send him to the gallows. She was the reason this had all gone wrong. If he'd killed her properly 2 years ago, he wouldn't be in this situation now. He grabbed his last man, a young outlaw named Skinner, and hissed instructions. The girl in the doorway, the deaf one, that's our ticket out. We take her hostage. We can negotiate our way out of this. Skinner looked doubtful, but nodded. They had no other options. Luke saw the movement, saw Blackwood's attention shift toward the medical station, and understood immediately what the outlaw planned. He tried to move, to get a shot, but the wound in his side stole his speed. He shouted a warning, but Clara couldn't hear it. Blackwood and Skinner made their move, bursting from cover in a desperate sprint toward the medical station. They covered the distance before anyone could react. Skinner grabbing Clara and dragging her into the street while Blackwood held the townspeople at bay with his revolver. Clara felt hands grab her, felt herself pulled roughly into the open. She couldn't hear the shouts, the warnings, but she understood the situation immediately. Hostage. She was a hostage. She could feel Skinner's arm around her throat, smell the sweat and gunpowder on him, see Blackwood's face as he positioned himself to use her as a shield, and she saw recognition in Blackwood's eyes. He knew her, knew who she was, knew she was the girl who'd witnessed him burn her family alive. Let her go. Sheriff Dalton shouted. It's over, Blackwood. You can't win this. Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound. I've got the girl. That changes things. We walk out of here nice and peaceful, or she dies. Your choice. Luke appeared at the edge of a roof, bleeding but steady, his rifle aimed at Blackwood. But the angle was wrong. Clara was in the way, a human shield. He couldn't take the shot without risking her. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Clara saw everything in Luke's face. Fear for her, rage at his helplessness, desperate love he'd never spoken aloud. She saw it clearly, read it like she'd learned to read lips and gestures, and she understood that he would sacrifice anything, anyone, including himself, to save her. She couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let this man who'd murdered her family and terrorized this town escape, using her as his shield. Clara had spent 2 years being a victim, being afraid, running from what Blackwood had done to her family. But Luke had taught her something else. He'd taught her to fight, to be strong, to survive. He'd given her the tools and the confidence to stand up rather than cower. She remembered the knife, Luke's father's hunting knife, tucked in her belt beneath her jacket where Skinner hadn't thought to check. In his arrogance, assuming a deaf woman was helpless, he'd made a fatal mistake. Clara's hand moved slowly, carefully, finding the knife's handle. She felt Skinner's grip loosen slightly as Blackwood shouted negotiations at the sheriff. They thought they'd won. Thought she was beaten. They were wrong. In one fluid motion, practiced 100 times with Luke in their training sessions, Clara drove her elbow back into Skinner's ribs, twisted out of his grip, and brought the knife up in a short, vicious arc. She felt it connect, felt Skinner's gasp of pain and surprise, felt his grip release completely. She dropped and rolled, exactly as Luke had taught her, getting clear of the danger zone. And in that moment of chaos, with Clara safe, Luke took his shot. The bullet caught Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around. Sheriff Dalton rushed in, weapon drawn, and the outlaw leader knew it was truly over. He dropped his gun, hands raising in surrender, his face twisted with pain and fury. Skinner was down, bleeding but alive, clutching the knife wound in his side. The remaining gang member threw down his weapon and raised his hands high, wanting no part of continued resistance. The battle for Willow Bend was over. Clara lay in the dust where she'd rolled, breathing hard, her whole body shaking with reaction. Then Luke was there, sliding down from the roof despite his wound, pulling her up, checking her for injuries with frantic hands. When he was satisfied she was unharmed, he pulled her against his chest and held her like he'd never let go. Porter and Margaret rushed over, Sarah right behind them. The whole town seemed to pour into the street, checking on each other, helping the wounded, securing the prisoners. Someone brought rope to bind Blackwood and his surviving men. Someone else ran for the doctor who'd been standing by at the church. Mrs. Henley appeared with bandages, taking charge of Luke's wound with no-nonsense efficiency. Sit down, you stubborn man, before you bleed out. You too, Clara, both of you into the medical station now. They complied, too exhausted to argue. As Margaret cleaned and stitched Luke's wound, he kept his eyes on Clara, who sat nearby being checked over, despite her protests that she was fine. Their hands found each other across the space between them, fingers lacing together, holding on. Sheriff Dalton came in later, his face grim. Lost one of ours, young Thomas Brenner. Took a bullet protecting the church when one of them tried to circle around. Died doing something brave. Luke closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of command, the knowledge that his orders, his plans, had resulted in someone's death. Clara squeezed his hand tighter, and when he opened his eyes, she was looking at him with understanding. She knew this pain, knew the guilt of surviving when others didn't. He saved 12 people in that church, Dalton continued, including children. His choice, his sacrifice. He'd want you to know that. Luke nodded, accepting the words even if they didn't ease the burden. What about Blackwood? He asked, talking already, trying to deal. confessed to a whole string of crimes, including the murder of Clara's family. Said her father witnessed a stage robbery, could identify them, so they eliminated the whole family to tie up loose ends. Dalton's face was hard. He's going to hang for it. Federal marshal's already on his way. This is bigger than just today. He's wanted in 4 territories. Clara had been reading their lips following the conversation. She pulled out paper and wrote, "Will I have to testify?" "Probably," Dalton said gently. "But you won't face him alone. We'll all be there. Every person in this town will stand with you." Mrs. Henley nodded firmly. "That's a promise, dear girl. What we did to you when you arrived, turning you away, treating you as less than, we were wrong. Shamefully wrong. You've proven yourself 100 times over, and this town owes you a debt we can never fully repay." Clara wrote, "You already have. You fought for me. That's more than I ever dreamed anyone would do." As evening fell, the town began to recover from the battle. The wounded were tended, the dead prepared for burial, the prisoners secured in a makeshift jail in the livery stable. People gathered in the street, no longer divided by prejudice or disagreement, but united by what they'd survived together. Porter stood on his porch and called for attention. When the crowd quieted, he spoke clearly. "Today we proved something. Not just that we could fight when we had to, but that we're better together than divided." Clara Brennan came to our town, asking only for a chance, and we turned her away. Luke Carver stood up for her when none of us would. They both fought for us today, saved us, and I, for one, am ashamed it took a crisis to make me see what I should have seen from the start. That worth isn't measured by what someone can or can't hear, but by the strength of their character. He gestured to Clara, who stood beside Luke near the medical station. "Clara, on behalf of this town, I apologize for our cruelty and our ignorance, and I promise you, from this day forward, you'll never lack for friends or family here. Willow Bend is your home, for as long as you want it to be." The crowd erupted in agreement, people calling out their own apologies and promises. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. She'd come here seeking only work and perhaps a place to belong. She'd found something far greater, a home, a community, and in Luke, something she hadn't dared to hope for. Love. Luke turned to her as the crowd began to disperse, and he pulled out paper for one more message. "I have something to ask you. I was going to wait, going to do this properly, but after today, after nearly losing you, I can't wait anymore." He knelt in the dust of the street, in front of the whole town, and continued writing. "Clara Brennan, will you marry me? Will you make this mountain man the happiest fool in Montana and agree to be my wife?" The crowd went silent, waiting. Sarah grabbed her mother's hand, bouncing with excitement. Mrs. Henley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Porter grinned wide. Clara took the pencil with shaking hands and wrote a single word, "Yes." Then she pulled Luke to his feet and kissed him, right there in front of everyone, and the town erupted in cheers and celebration. The days following the battle passed in a blur of activity and emotion. The town buried Thomas Brenner with full honors, the young man who'd sacrificed himself protecting others. Clara placed wildflowers on his grave, the same kind she'd carried, when she arrived and vowed silently to live in a way that honored his sacrifice. Blackwood and his surviving men were taken away by federal marshals, bound for trial and almost certainly the gallows. Before he left, Blackwood had been forced to face Clara one final time, to see the girl he'd tried to murder, who'd survived everything he'd thrown at her and stood stronger for it. He'd looked away first, unable to meet her steady gaze. Clara gave her testimony to the marshals, writing out everything she'd witnessed that terrible night 2 years ago. Luke sat beside her the entire time, his hand never leaving hers. When she finished, the senior marshal told her that her testimony, combined with Blackwood's own confessions, would ensure justice was finally served for her family. "Your parents and brother would be proud of you," the marshal said, making sure she could read his lips. "You survived, and you made sure he'd pay for what he did. That takes more courage than most people ever find." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of closure, of a burden finally lifted. Luke held her as she cried, his own eyes wet with emotion he no longer tried to hide. The town transformed in the aftermath of the crisis. Signs in simple hand signs appeared in shop windows. Sarah organized regular lessons in basic signing, and nearly everyone in Willow Bend attended. Children picked it up fastest, of course, and soon it was common to see groups of youngsters signing to each other on the street. Treating it like a secret language they all shared, Mrs. Henley proved to be one of the most dedicated students, determined to make amends for her earlier cruelty. She approached Clara a week after the battle with a formal written invitation. "Would you do me the honor of staying at my boarding house while you prepare for your wedding? Free of charge, of course, and I promise you'll be treated as the honored guest you deserve to be." Clara accepted, touched by the gesture of reconciliation. The room Mrs. Henley gave her was the finest in the house, with lace curtains and a view of the mountains where Luke's cabin sat. Each morning, Clara would look out at those peaks and think about the life waiting for her there. The wedding preparations consumed the town. Margaret insisted on making Clara's dress, a beautiful creation in cream-colored silk with lace Clara had embroidered herself during long evenings at the boarding house. Sarah served as bridesmaid, practicing her signing constantly so she could interpret the ceremony for Clara. Porter's wife organized the reception, determined to throw Willow Bend's finest celebration. The whole town would attend. This was more than just a wedding. It was a symbol of the community's transformation, proof that they'd become something better than they'd been before. Luke spent the week before the wedding making improvements to the cabin. He added a room, expanded the porch, built proper furniture to replace the rough pieces he'd cobbled together for his solitary existence. Porter helped, as did Sheriff Dalton and a dozen other men from town, all of them wanting to contribute to the couple's future. One evening, as they worked by lantern light, Porter asked the question several men had been wondering. "You nervous? About getting married, I mean." Luke considered the question as he planed a board smooth. "No," he said finally. "Nervous implies doubt. I have none. Clara's the best thing that ever happened to me. Only thing I'm nervous about is not being good enough for her." "She seems to think you are," Dalton observed. "And that woman's got good judgment. Saved all our lives with that knife move." Luke smiled, remembering the moment Clara had fought back against Skinner, had saved herself when he couldn't get to her. Pride swelled in his chest every time he thought about it. She was no damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a warrior in her own right, and she'd chosen him. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the kind of day that made Montana seem like paradise. The church had been decorated with wildflowers, Clara's request, and every pew was packed with townspeople dressed in their finest. Clothes. Luke stood at the altar in a new suit that Porter had ordered special from Denver, his hair trimmed, his beard shaped, looking almost civilized despite the lingering wildness in his eyes. Sheriff Dalton stood with him as best man, while Sarah fidgeted excitedly in her bridesmaid dress near the front pew. The doors opened, and Clara appeared on Porter's arm. He'd offered to give her away, standing in for the father she'd lost, and Clara had accepted gratefully. She wore the cream silk dress that caught the light streaming through the windows, her dark hair adorned with small wildflowers, and in her hand she carried a bouquet of mountain blooms, columbine, lupine, and arnica. She was the most beautiful thing Luke had ever seen. As Porter walked her down the aisle, Clara's eyes never left Luke's face. She saw everything there, love, wonder, commitment, and a peace he'd never known before she arrived. She'd given him that peace just as surely as he'd given her safety and belonging. They reached the altar, and Porter placed Clara's hand in Luke's. The preacher began speaking, and Sarah stood beside Clara, signing every word so she could follow the ceremony. The vows were traditional, speaking of love and commitment, of facing life's challenges together, of building a future side by side. When the preacher asked if they would take each other as husband and wife, Clara and Luke spoke their answers simultaneously, his aloud, hers in sign, both unmistakably clear. "I do," the preacher smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." "Luke, you may kiss your bride." Luke took Clara's face gently in his hands and kissed her with all the love he'd discovered he was capable of feeling. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and when they finally broke apart, both were smiling through tears of joy. The reception at Porter's saloon was unlike anything Willow Bend had seen before. Tables groaned under the weight of food the townswomen had prepared. Roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables from early gardens, pies and cakes of every description. Porter had opened his best bottles, and music filled the air as a fiddle player and guitarist played lively dance tunes. Clara and Luke led the first dance, moving together with a grace that surprised those who'd known Luke only as the stern mountain man. He'd learned to dance as a boy, taught by his mother, and he guided Clara through the steps with patient care. She followed the rhythm she felt through the vibrations in the floor and through Luke's body. Her feet moving in perfect time with his, Sarah cried watching them. Happy tears that her mother dabbed away with a handkerchief while smiling herself. Mrs. Henley stood with them, and when the song ended, she approached the newlyweds with something in her hands. It was a hope chest. Beautiful cedar wood, with brass fittings, filled with linens and quilts the women of Willow Bend had stitched together. Each piece bore a small embroidered signature of the woman who'd made it, a community effort to welcome Clara fully into their lives. Clara's hands shook as she examined each piece, seeing the names Margaret, Sarah, Mrs. Henley, women she'd worked with, women who'd once turned away from her, women who'd become friends and neighbors. She looked up at Mrs. Henley with tears streaming down her face. The older woman signed awkwardly, but clearly. "Welcome home." Clara embraced her, and Mrs. Henley held her tight. This girl she'd rejected and then learned to love. This young woman who'd taught a whole town about courage and grace. The celebration continued late into the evening. Stories were told, toasts were made, and gradually the focus shifted from the wedding itself to something larger, to what the town had become, to the lessons they'd learned, to the changes they'd committed to maintaining. Sheriff Dalton stood to speak, raising his glass. "A few months ago, a young woman stepped off a stagecoach looking for work and a place to belong. We turned her away. We judged her for being different. We treated her with cruelty she didn't deserve, and it took a crisis, a battle, and nearly losing her to make us see what Luke Carver saw from the first moment. That Clara is remarkable, not despite her deafness, but because of who she is. Brave, kind, skilled, and stronger than most of us will ever be." He turned to Clara and Luke. "You two taught us something essential. You taught us that love means standing with someone when everyone else sits down. That courage means facing fear rather than running from it. That home isn't a place, but the people who see you for who you truly are. So here's to Clara and Luke Carver. May your life together be long, happy, and filled with all the peace and joy you both deserve." The crowd drank to the toast, and then Porter stood, adding his own words. "And here's to Willow Bend becoming the kind of town worthy of people like Clara and Luke, a place where different is celebrated, not feared, where everyone gets a fair chance, where we stand together instead of apart, more cheers, more drinking, more celebration." As the evening wore on, Luke and Clara slipped away quietly, mounting Luke's horse for the ride up to their cabin. The moon was full and bright, lighting their path up the mountain trail they both knew so well now. The cabin looked different, larger, more welcoming, truly a home now rather than a bachelor's shelter. Inside, everything was ready for them. The bed freshly made with sheets from Mrs. Henley's gift, the fire laid and waiting to be lit, flowers in jars on the new furniture the men had built. Luke lit the fire while Clara explored the additions, the extra room that would serve as her sewing workshop, the expanded porch where they could sit together in the evenings, the shelves Luke had built specifically for her books and supplies. Every detail spoke of thought and care, of Luke imagining their life together and preparing for it. She turned to find him watching her, his expression soft in the firelight. She crossed to him and took his hands, signing slowly. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me, for standing with me, for giving me this life. Luke's response was to pull her close and kiss her deeply. When they finally broke apart, he led her to the table where he'd left one more gift, the journal he'd been keeping. The one filled with sketches of mountains and wildlife and sparse entries about his solitary life. He opened it to a new section, pages he'd filled in recent weeks. Sketches of Clara working in the garden, Clara laughing with Sarah, Clara placing flowers on Thomas's grave. And between the sketches, words, entries about how she'd changed his life, about gratitude and wonder and love he'd thought himself incapable of feeling. Clara read through tears, seeing herself through Luke's eyes, not as damaged or limited, but as whole and beautiful and strong. She looked up at him, unable to find words adequate to express what she felt. "You don't need words," Luke said, knowing she'd read his lips even in the dim firelight.
"I can see it in your eyes."
"I can feel it every time you look at me." "We don't need words, Clara. We never did." She smiled and nodded, then pulled him toward the bedroom, toward the life they'd begin building together this night and every night after. The fire crackled behind them. The mountains stood eternal around them, and inside the cabin, two souls who'd been lost had finally found their way home. Outside, the wildflowers Clara had planted in the window boxes swayed gently in the night breeze, their blooms catching the moonlight. The same kind of flowers she'd carried when she arrived, when she'd been rejected and afraid. Now they marked her true beginning, the start of a life she'd barely dared to dream possible. In town, people were still celebrating, still talking about the wedding and the battle and the changes they'd witnessed. Children played, practicing signs they'd learned. Adults made plans to continue the lessons, to make Willow Bend a place where everyone could communicate, where no one would be left out or turned away. Sarah sat with her parents on their porch, watching the stars. "Do you think they'll be happy?" she asked. Porter smiled. "Happier than most, I'd wager. They've been through fire, literally, and came out stronger." "That's the kind of love that lasts," Margaret nodded agreement. "And we'll be here for them whenever they need us." "That's what family does." "What community does." In Mrs. Henley's boarding house, the woman sat alone in her parlor, thinking about Clara's grace in accepting her apology, about second chances and transformation. She'd spent years being rigid and judgmental, and it had taken a crisis and a brave young woman to show her a better way. She was grateful for the lesson, even if learning it had been painful. The town slept that night with a sense of completion, of having passed through a trial and emerged better for it. They'd faced danger together, fought together, and in doing so had forged bonds that would last generations. Children growing up in Willow Bend would learn sign language as naturally as English. They'd hear stories about the deaf woman who taught their town about courage, and the mountain man who'd stood with her when no one else would. And in a cabin high in the mountains, Clara and Luke Carver began their marriage with hope, love, and the certain knowledge that whatever challenges life brought, they'd face them together. 3 months passed like a dream. Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the cabin that had once housed only Luke's solitude now rang with the quiet happiness of a well-matched partnership. Clara's touches were everywhere, curtains in the windows, herbs drying from the rafters, her sewing materials organized in the new workshop room, the garden still producing vegetables they preserved for winter. Luke had never been happier. He woke each morning to Clara beside him, spent his days working the land and teaching her new skills, and passed his evenings watching her embroider by firelight while he carved small wooden figures he'd started making, a new hobby she'd inspired. They communicated seamlessly now, their language of signs and gestures and written words as natural as breathing. Twice a week, Clara still went to town to work with Margaret, though now it was as much for the social connection as the income. Her reputation as a seamstress had spread, and she received commissions from across the territory. The wedding dress she'd altered for Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter had been so beautiful that requests flooded in. Clara could have worked full-time if she'd wanted, but she preferred the balance, some time in town, some time in the mountains with Luke, Sarah remained her closest friend, visiting the cabin often to practice signing and share town news. The young woman had grown confident under Clara's influence, no longer the shy girl hiding behind her father, but someone with her own voice and opinions. She'd started courting the blacksmith's son, a quiet young man who was learning to sign specifically to communicate with Sarah's best friend. Mrs. Henley had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation. She'd become Clara's staunchest defender and advocate, using her considerable social influence to ensure that anyone new to Willow Bend understood that Clara Carver was to be treated with respect. She'd organized the sign language classes, hosted them in her boarding house parlor, and attended every session herself until she could communicate basic conversations. The town itself had changed in ways both visible and subtle. Signs in shop windows included simple hand sign illustrations. The school had added signing to its curriculum. Children grew up understanding that different ways of communicating were normal and valuable. Willow Bend had become something rare on the frontier, a place where acceptance wasn't just preached but practiced. One crisp October morning, Clara realized she'd missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be certain, then shared the news with Luke through written words and trembling hands. "I think I'm carrying a child." Luke's face transformed with joy and wonder. He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was. A child, their child. A family built from two people who'd both lost their first families to tragedy and violence. They rode to town that afternoon to see the doctor, who confirmed Clara's suspicion. She was about 2 months along, healthy, and the baby appeared to be developing well. The doctor, an older man who delivered half the babies in the territory, made sure Clara could read his lips when he said, "You'll be a wonderful mother. And that husband of yours looks like he's ready to burst with pride." Luke was indeed beaming, unable to hide his happiness. They told Sarah first, who screamed with joy and hugged them both. Then Margaret and Porter, who immediately started planning a celebration. By evening, the whole town knew, and well-wishers stopped by Porter's store where Clara was working to offer congratulations and gifts. Tiny knitted blankets, carved toys, offers of help and advice. Mrs. Henley appeared with a cradle that had been in her family for generations. "My children used it and my grandchildren," she said, making sure Clara could see her words. "I'd be honored if your baby used it too," Clara accepted with tears in her eyes. Understanding the significance of the gift, Mrs. Henley was claiming Clara as family, the daughter she'd never had, and the coming baby as a grandchild of her heart, if not her blood. That night, back at the cabin, Clara and Luke sat on the new porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara's hand rested on her still flat belly, and Luke's hand covered hers. They didn't need words to share the moment, the hope, the joy, the slight fear that came with such happiness, the awareness of how blessed they were. Luke pulled out paper and wrote, "Our child will grow up knowing both worlds, the mountains and the town, silence and sound, signing and speaking. They'll be so loved," Clara wrote back. "They'll grow up knowing that different is not less. That courage means standing up for what's right. That love transcends any barrier. We'll make sure of it." A month later, on a cold November morning, a stagecoach rolled into Willow Bend. A young woman stepped down, looking uncertain and afraid. She was thin, poorly dressed, and walked with a pronounced limp from an old injury. The stage driver helped her with her single bag, and she stood on the boardwalk, looking lost. Clara happened to be in town that day, working at Margaret's shop. She saw the young woman through the window and recognized something in her posture. The defensive hunch, the expectation of rejection, the desperate hope warring with fear. She looked the way Clara had looked months ago, arriving in this same town, facing an uncertain future. Clara put down her sewing and walked outside. She approached the young woman slowly, making sure not to startle her, and signed a greeting. The woman looked confused, so Clara pulled out a card she'd had printed, like the one she'd carried when she arrived, but different. This one read, "Welcome to Willow Bend. My name is Clara Carver. If you need help, we're here for you. Everyone deserves a chance." The young woman read the card, and her eyes filled with tears. "I was told frontier towns don't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who are different," she said, gesturing to her leg. "I came anyway because I had nowhere else to go." Clara wrote quickly, "You came to the right place. This town learned something important recently, that different isn't wrong, it's just different. Come with me, let's get you settled." She took the young woman's arm and led her toward Mrs. Henley's boarding house. Sarah emerged from Porter's store and joined them, immediately friendly and welcoming. Other townspeople stopped to greet the newcomer with genuine warmth, offering help without judgment. The young woman looked around in wonder. "I've never seen a town like this. There aren't many like it," Sarah admitted. "But there should be. We're working on that." Mrs. Henley opened her door before they even knocked, having seen them coming. "Welcome, dear," she said clearly and slowly. "I'm Mrs. Henley, and I run this boarding house. You look tired and hungry. Come in, and we'll get you sorted out. What's your name?" "Emily," the young woman said. "Emily Rhodes. Well, Miss Rhodes, you're safe here. Willow Bend takes care of its own." Clara squeezed Emily's hand and signed, "You're going to be just fine. Trust me, I know." Up in the mountains, Luke was working on a rocking chair for the baby's room, the wood smooth under his practiced hands. He paused to look out at the valley below, at the town where his wife was at that moment, showing another lost soul what kindness looked like. He smiled, thinking about how far they'd both come, about the family they were building, about the legacy they'd leave. A life that had once seemed over had instead just begun. Clara had taught him that. She'd taught a whole town that, and now they were teaching others, passing forward the grace and courage and acceptance they'd fought so hard to find. The sun set over Montana Territory, painting the mountains in shades of gold. Smoke rose from chimneys in Willow Bend, each column representing a family, a life, a story. And in one cabin, high above the valley, a man carved wood for his unborn child, while his wife helped a stranger find hope. And both of them knew without question that they'd found exactly where they were meant to be. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand up when everyone else is sitting down. Sometimes kindness shows up in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to face the world despite what tries to hold you back, you find that the world can be braver too. Clara had proven that. Luke had believed it. Willow Bend had learned it, and the story continued, one act of courage at a time, one person standing with another, one community choosing compassion over fear. The wildflowers Clara had planted around the cabin bloomed year after year, resilient and beautiful, a living reminder that even the harshest soil could nurture beauty if tended with care. In the years to come, Clara and Luke's child would be born, a daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's storm-grey eyes. They named her Grace, after the quality that had saved them both. She would grow up fluent in both spoken English and sign language, moving between both worlds with the ease of someone who'd never known division. She would learn to track deer with her father, to embroider with her mother, and to understand that strength came in many forms. Emily Rhodes, the young woman who'd arrived that November day, would stay in Willow Bend. She'd open a small bakery, her limp never slowing her down, and she'd become known for making the best bread in 3 counties. She'd marry the shy blacksmith's son after Sarah moved on to marry a surveyor from Denver, and she'd raise 3 children who grew up knowing that their mother had been given a chance when she needed it most, and that the gift of that chance was something to be passed forward. Mrs. Henley would live another 15 years, long enough to see Grace Carver take her first steps, speak her first words, and sign her first sentences. On her deathbed, surrounded by the women she'd once judged and who'd become her dearest friends, she would say to Clara, "Thank you for teaching an old woman that it's never too late to become who you should have been all along." Sheriff Dalton would retire eventually, passing his badge to a younger man he'd trained well, someone who understood that justice meant protecting everyone, especially those whom society tried to make invisible. The new sheriff would continue the tradition of sign language fluency, making it a requirement for anyone who worked in law enforcement in Willow Bend. Porter and Margaret would watch their grandchildren grow up in a town transformed by one young woman's courage and one man's choice to stand beside her. They would tell the story often, how Clara arrived, how she was rejected, how Luke stood up for her, how a battle brought them all together, and how love and acceptance had changed everything. The cabin in the mountains would see many gatherings over the years, friends coming to visit. Town meetings held on the expanded porch during summer months, children playing in the meadow, while adults talked and laughed. It would become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over isolation, when they built bridges instead of walls, and every spring, without fail, Clara would gather wildflowers, the same kinds she'd carried when she first arrived in Willow Bend. Some she'd plant around the cabin, some she'd bring to town to share, and some she'd place on Thomas Brenner's grave, honoring the young man who died protecting others during the battle that changed everything. Luke would watch her do this each year, and each year he'd feel the same gratitude wash over him, gratitude that he'd been in town that day, that he'd seen her standing alone on that boardwalk, that something had moved him to cross the street and offer help when no one else would. One decision, one moment of choosing compassion over convenience, had given him everything worth having. On their 10th anniversary, sitting on that same porch where they'd spent countless evenings, Clara would write in the journal they now shared, 10 years ago, I arrived in Willow Bend with nothing but a suitcase and some wildflowers, looking for work and a place to belong. I found so much more. I found a home, a family, a purpose, and a love I never dreamed possible. But more than that, I found proof that one person standing up can change everything. Luke stood up for me. Then others stood up for us both. And now we stand together, all of us, building something better than what came before. That's the real story. Not that I survived, but that together we all learned how to truly live. Luke would read her words and add his own. I came to these mountains to hide from the world. Clara taught me that hiding isn't living. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand despite it. She taught me that love means seeing someone fully, not despite their differences, but including them, celebrating them even. I was the one who offered her shelter, but she's the one who saved me. Every day I spend with her is a gift I never expected to receive. Their daughter, Grace, reading these entries years later as an adult, would understand the legacy her parents had built, not just in their love for each other, but in what they'd created around them. A community that valued every person, a place where different was celebrated, a home where everyone belonged. The mountains would stand eternal, as they always had, watching over the valley and the town and the people who made their lives in that rugged, beautiful country. The seasons would turn, bringing change and constancy in equal measure. And in a cabin high above Willow Bend, a family built on courage and compassion would thrive, proving every day that the bravest thing a person can do is stand with someone. When the whole world sits down, that's how it started, with wildflowers and rejection and one man's decision to do what was right instead of what was easy. And that's how it continued, with love, acceptance, and the understanding that we're all stronger together than apart. Some stories end with happily ever after, but the best ones understand that happiness isn't a destination, but a daily choice, a commitment renewed with every sunrise, a gift given and received with grateful hearts. Clara and Luke Carver chose happiness every single day, and in doing so, they taught everyone around them that they could make that choice too. That was their true legacy, not that they fell in love or survived danger or built a good life together, but that they showed others how to do the same. The wildflowers bloomed each spring, resilient and beautiful, a promise that winter's darkness would always yield to light. And in that mountain cabin, surrounded by love and family and the community they'd helped transform, Clara and Luke Carver lived out their days, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of human kindness. choosing to stand with someone who needs you, and discovering in that standing that they were exactly what you needed too.